My name is Melissa Alexander. I'll start by saying that I really like coming to the Geodesign conference because it's small enough that I get to say hi to almost everybody in person, but it's big enough to attract this really wide cross-section of professionals who oftentimes are using the same tools that I am, but in really different and usually inspiring ways. To that end, the talk that I prepared today, Geodesign Challenges and Practice, it's catered specifically to my experiences as an architect and an urban designer working as a consultant. So I know many of you are working in the public sector or working in academia or maybe for a nonprofit. But in my sort of consulting part of the world, our work is very episodic. We're plugged into a process for a very specific set of tasks for a very finite amount of time. But we're still hoping to make a big impact as a group of individuals, and that way of working comes with its own challenges. So you've seen these diagrams several times over the past couple of days. On the left-hand side is sort of the thumbnail view of the geodesign process, and then on the right is a more detailed workflow. So for the purposes of my presentation, I took the image on the right, I flipped it horizontal just so it fits better on the slide, and I picked happier colors. So you'll see this a couple of times throughout the presentation. You're welcome. So there's a lot to like about the geodesign process. It's robust, which means a lot of different practice types can use it. It's data-driven, and it has these key iterative loops, which are really important. The tools and the workflows promote transparency. Participation by a wide variety of stakeholders is really mandatory. And all that's really good stuff. I really like it. But it can sometimes be a struggle to achieve this full geodesign process in practice. It can be challenging within single projects, and it can also be challenging when we start to think about the nested, sequential, or cyclical nature of the processes that dominate planning for cities and large institutions. So I thought it would be useful to identify a few of those challenges, and because we have limited time, I'll just have to limit to just a few specific examples and then branch out to some other items with smaller references or hypotheticals. And the purpose of this talk isn't just to come on stage and complain about how hard my job is, because I really like my job. But the purpose of this talk is to identify key challenges that present themselves in practice, to seed conversations about future development of technology to support the geodesign process. This is the place to do that. And to provoke the project-based nature of the geodesign process as we've seen it over the last 8, 9, 10 years. So with that, the project that I brought to talk about today, to explain some of the challenges, a few years ago we were approached by a hospital with this really important question: where should we locate our next primary care, urgent care, X-ray, and lab locations? It's an important question, and it's one that needs to be asked kind of every time we need to locate these places, because the nature of how we provide care changes. The last doctor's appointment that I had, I actually called up a doctor who I had never talked to before, explained my issues. She called in some medication to a pharmacy, and I picked it up an hour later. So that type of change has major spatial implications. So things like technology and the way that we just relate to each other. So the boundaries of our analysis were determined by the hospital's market area as it was presented to us, and that was everything in this really thick black line. So they had a primary market area, which is the darkest blue, a secondary market area, which is the lightest blue, and then what they called their emerging market. It's a little hard to see in this projection, but there's this hatched area all around the edges. It's sort of a one zip code boundary around the project that as I told you, I'm an architect, so by training, so I insisted that we add this ring all the way around because as an architect, I always want to do just a little bit more than you want me to. And again, here's the geodesign process. So I thought I'd just present this project to you, sort of going down the geodesign process, and that way we can identify the pinch points together. So to start with, project definition, we've got project initiation, goals and objectives, getting your getting your stakeholder groups defined and getting them together so they understand that they're going to be expected to attend a lot of meetings. Check, check, check. We always do that on projects. So this isn't anything that's very new or outside of the normal. Data management. We had a lot of data management for this project. We used Esri data, so demographics, ACS data, census data that are made readily available, zip codes, counties, and census boundaries that I could take those containers and then join more information to, and then transportation data. We have healthcare forecasting subscription data, so I'm sure some of you know there are companies in the United States and abroad whose sole mission is to, with their proprietary model, forecast the growth of different healthcare service lines. And when I say service lines, what that means is primary care is a service line, urgent care is a service line. So knowing what zip codes are expected to have the most growth of certain service lines, we pay for that every single year, lots of money. And then the hospital provided us with a certain amount of data, so patient locations, all with the identity scrubbed, of course, and then their own locations and their affiliates and competitor service locations. If anybody has a better idea about how to present database management in slide form, I'm open to it. It could have been an Excel spreadsheet. I chose my face. I'm not really sure that's any better. But we did a lot of conditions assessment, obviously, with all that data. Any type of data that I got my hands on that I could map spatially, I did. So we had all of that as a starting point, all of our drive time information for all of our facilities that were located out on the right, calculating cannibalization rates, which sometimes means people eating other people, but in this case, what it means is if you locate new services next to your existing services, you're going to gain in market share, but you're going to eat some of your own market share as a part of that. That service forecasting information, so we always like to present information in two different formats. Some people really understand charts and graphs and things like that. That type of information presentation makes sense to them. Some people really need that map to visualize things. So we try not to choose and we just provide both just as a baseline. So what you're seeing here is the urgent care in the hatched areas. That's the top 10, the top 10 zip codes for growth of that specific service line. And then finally, that patient data. So all of those locations were geocoded, obscured just a little bit for confidentiality. And then I did all sorts of analysis that you can do with points like kernel densities and spatial joins to census block boundaries. And then also just digging into their data and figuring out what their patients were coming in for, what times of the day, what times of the week, what times of the year they were actually getting those sort of peaks and lows. Okay, so once we had all that data, we moved on to this next phase here, the geo-related planning. And I think we covered that phase. We sat down with our stakeholders and said, we have all this information, it's all been mapped. What do you think is going to be the most important factors or parameters in where we'll locate these new facilities? And what we decided is for urgent care in particular, there were 15 different facets that we wanted to use in our suitability analysis. We did a forced ranking here on the left, so we had all the stakeholder groups rank which of those layers were more important than others. From there, I could very easily derive the percentages for the weighted overlays, and then on the right-hand side, you can see those 15 areas as they were classified. Red is better, green is okay, yellow is worse. You'll notice, so voila, suitability analysis in 5 minutes. And so what you'll notice here, again, there's that thick black boundary of what they decided their market area was. We found these 3 clusters of the most suitable areas. And interesting, not the point of this talk, but interestingly, all of those locations are located in that ring that we insisted on studying. So we think we provided some real value to our clients there. And these are just sort of zoomed in views of one of those locations. So that takes us through geo-related planning. You'll notice that I'm skipping over evaluation because, spoiler alert, that's going to be a pinch point. And then implementation, documentation, and acceptance, of course. We're always making a report. We're always seeking project acceptance. Sometimes we make a website. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the cover of the report, and then on the right-hand side, the press release from some months later where this specific hospital is opening 3 new urgent care centers. So that was really, how'd I do? 9 minutes, okay. So we consider this project a success. Our clients were happy, we were happy, they acted on our results, project was profitable, so it's a win-win-win. But is it a geodesign process? Because that's really what we're digging into today. And so I think the pinch points for this particular project really come around the evaluation phase, so 14 and 15. And the reason for that, there's a couple of different reasons. So scope and contract. The scope that we specified for this particular project is that we would deliver a variety of options to the client. So number 15, select a preferred plan, it was just outside of our scope. And in our scope was the final solution was going to be determined by others. So the scope can sometimes limit what you're able to do as a consultant. Scale and expertise, my firm was the best choice to analyze this very large area, and we have specific healthcare expertise, hospital strategists, hospital futurists, so we were the right choice for that. But at some point, you get down to a level in the scale where we actually found those clusters where we weren't the experts anymore. And so what we needed to do was pass that information on to local commercial real estate brokers who had that in-depth knowledge. A lot of times it's things like, they have knowledge that's not documented anywhere, and they're not even really supposed to talk about it because their colleague knows that somebody bought this parcel because they've contracted and they're going to do this type of retail establishment, but right across the street, you can get this parcel this person wants to sell. There's no way that we're going to know that information. So passing it off to somebody with expertise at a different scale was really important for this project. And finally, technology ownership. The data might be transferred, but the analytical tools and processes that we do with that information, those are rarely transferred on to the client. So that means there's no real way for future consultants to build into our geodesign process. So let's have a little thought experiment. That project is a couple of years old and we didn't have access to GeoPlanner, but now we do. So how could GeoPlanner help us with some of those pinch points? And so the first item is breaking that contract barrier between consultants. Instead of offering finite solutions, we could rewrite the scope to say, we're not going to do finite solutions, but what we will do is a tool that can adjust to new forecasts, new suitability models, and then after we're done with the project, the client can keep the tool, and then they can also have future consultants actually use it in the future. GeoPlanner is really easy to use, and especially the suitability analysis portion, where you're changing the classification with sliders and re-entering the percentage of importance of those layers just in the box. Giving a client a slider is just, because they can actually go in and adjust things, and then they can say, all right, there's 15 layers here. There's no way that I can imagine what the outcomes would be, but if I sit here long enough and kind of adjust these sliders and toggles, I really start to understand that specific analysis. And then when they go into their C-suite meetings and they're making decisions, they're really confident about their decisions because they really understand the analysis. And that confident decision-making is good for everybody. And then finally, new client relationship paradigms. Shifts from episodic planning to account management retainer model. Most of our work is done in individual scopes of work. And then a particular entity will engage with another consultant to do another part of the work. What if we start to provoke that or push that a little bit? And maybe we're paid a certain amount to set up this tool ahead of time, but then we're sort of consistent with the project where there's a sort of a spine of technology and data and analysis that other consultants can then build into. I'm aware that specific use of the technology might break our term of agreement with Esri, and so I just want to say we're not doing that. This is just a hypothetical. So nobody take my software away from me, I need it. So those were a couple of intra-project challenges, but in a sort of Eames movie, Powers of 10 way, what if we zoom out a little bit and say that was just one project? What are the types of challenges that might happen on other projects, or on projects that are larger in scale, projects that have sequential, cyclical planning processes where there's a lot of different players over 5, 10, or 15 years? What are the types of problems that might occur, the types of challenges that might occur in those cases? And as I show these next couple of slides, I want to stress what I was trying to do is generalize a process that's often very specific, is very idiosyncratic to a specific place. And so generalizing these processes in a way that's productive is really challenging. So just take these next few slides with just the biggest grains of salt. I'm just throwing salt all over you. So a civic planning template, what might happen first? You might have visioning, you might have other analysis, community needs assessments, those types of things. You might have sort of primary planning stages, comprehensive plan, economic plans, master plans. Maybe transportation plans might be a part of your master plan, it might be separate. Those usually trigger zoning. All of those planning documents then go on to inform development. What you'll notice is that there's not a lot of iterative loops, right? All of the lines keep going downstream, and that's a problem. So down here at the bottom, we have our geodesign process again. And I put these together and I asked myself, is this a geodesign process? Is this civic template a geodesign process? Or is geodesign just reserved for specific projects? And the way that they're chained together and the way that they impact each other, is that not a geodesign process? I don't have answers, I just have questions right now. What about academic planning? You know, academic planning is a little bit different. It's still a large institution. They still have a lot of land that they're covering and that they're planning for. Oftentimes they start out with a strategic plan. A capital plan might be separate. It might be a part of that strategic plan. Those go on to inform academic plans, and those are usually created by a provost. He's informed with annual plans that are updated every year by his deans or her deans. And then a long-range development plan, sometimes called a master plan. Sometimes those have analytical studies building into them. Sometimes there are separate campus plans or quad plans, and then all of that going on to inform development. So could this be a geodesign process? And then finally, planning for healthcare is very similar to academic planning. The difference here is that the master plan often leads to subplans in a healthcare campus. Sometimes those subplans are spatial, they're a certain quad. Sometimes they're based on service lines. So maybe all of your ambulatory care has its own master plan, and then somehow it has to relate back to the big master plan. There's also programming documents. So there are separate phases of the work that involve separate consultants who just figure out what should go in buildings and how big it should be. And those consultants are often precluded from actually doing the architecture because they're ethical concerns. That person or consultant doing the programming is actually saying the building should be a little bit bigger than it really needs to be because maybe they want more construction fees. So oftentimes they're precluded from doing the architecture work. So there again, you've got those contractual breaks between consultants that are challenging. So after I did all of that, I sort of sat down and tried to think, okay, the purpose of this talk. One, just identifying those challenges that present themselves in these really big planning processes, I think is a nice first step. Seeding conversations about technology to support the geodesign process. And for me, when I say geodesign process, I'm thinking bigger than just the project. How do these individual projects relate to each other? And then finally, to provoke that project-based nature of the geodesign process. And so with my last minute or two here, I took a stab at what we might start thinking of as a new geodesign process. We've been talking about geodesign for, like I said, 8, 9, 10 years now, and we've been mostly talking about projects that have starts and stops. Most of the diagrams that we see are very linear. But that's just not true in practice, right? Projects might have certificates of occupancy and construction completion, but planning is never finished. So I think we should stop drawing these diagrams as straight lines and start thinking about them as circles. And then I started thinking, well, what is that circle? What if this circle is actually the geodesign process, and we stop thinking of it just as a process, but also as a technology armature that sort of carries on with the project. And in that way, we're being really collaborative because we're all building into the same thing. Every single plan has a feedback loop, and development also has a feedback loop as well. So that's about as far as I got with the diagram. But my favorite definition of geodesign here, it says, geodesign is a design and planning method which tightly couples the creation of design proposals with impact simulations informed by geographic context. And I would like to suggest that perhaps we start thinking about altering that definition. Geodesign is the persistent, collaborative planning armature which tightly couples the creation of design proposals with impact simulations informed by geographic context. So, thank you.